In her role as a fellow, we are very privileged and very thankful to the Emmy Davenport Legacy Foundation for making her visit, her week-long visit to Davenport University, possible. As a Woodrow Wilson Fellow, it is indeed an esteemed honor that we have her on this campus. And if we would say that there was more of a timely discussion around civility and respect, and with that dignity, I think you'd all agree. A bit about Ms. Bartlett's background: a very accomplished woman. She has served on multiple professional roles in top Fortune 25 companies. Includes Exxon, includes Altria. She also has very, very deep commitment to the area of domestic violence, personal safety, development, and growth. And with that, I shall introduce to you Ms. Bartlett.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Some of you I have met before, some of you I am meeting for the first time, and it's an absolute delight to be here. If for any reason someone can't hear me, please let me know. It means that I haven't affixed the mic properly. But I think we've got all that down, and I think we're almost ready to start. I have loved being here for the last 2 days. This place is very special. You all know that. I didn't know that until 2 days ago. Not all campuses are created like this one. This is a pragmatic place. You're getting a terrific education. You'll be able to get a job immediately when you get out of college, but you're also learning something else. You're learning civility, you're learning respect, you're learning how to deal with other people, which is one of the core competencies in your life going forward, and I guarantee you it will be a core competency in your success in the workplace. Some of you have heard me in career lectures so far. Those of you who haven't, I hope to see as many of you as I can during the next couple of days when I'm here. Tonight I'm not going to talk about careers. I'm going to talk about something completely different. I'm going to tell you a story. The reason I'm telling you a story is because people remember stories. Long after I leave here, you will not remember my name, but you will remember the story. And it is the story that has value and the story that can mean something to you. So tonight, I'm going to be talking about one town, my town. It's a little different than Grand Rapids, but there are probably a great deal of similarities. And it's a story that I'm going to tell you that has good news. In a world where we're not hearing too much good news these days, I think this story has value, and I think you'll appreciate that. And it may give you ideas of how you can pay it forward in your lives going forward, because I am a big believer in paying it forward. Your school is founded on the principles that I translate to learn, earn, and return. You're in the learning phase. You will soon be in the earning phase. I am in the returning phase. That's the best phase of all. You get to give back. And we're going to talk about that tonight. So, let me start by saying, I believe that a few people working together can make a difference in the lives of many. It has always been thus so. So this is a story of how my little town is trying to create an environment where everyone feels safe and respected, much like the environment that you get a chance to enjoy here. I live in New Canaan, Connecticut. It's a tiny little town, about 20,000 people, 40 miles from New York City. A number of the people who live in the town are commuters. They take the train every morning to jobs in New York City, about an hour away, and for many years I was one of those folks. There are a number of people in town who are well off. There are also a number of people in town who depend for every meal on the local food bank. Every meal. 15 years ago, after I left my job in the corporate world, I joined several other people, social workers and teachers and police officers and other concerned citizens, to raise awareness about a problem no one was talking about. And that problem was domestic violence. I don't know how much or how many of you are aware of the problem. Maybe many of you are aware about it very personally. Maybe you've just heard about it. But it's an extensive problem and it's a pervasive problem. I got to know about domestic violence when I was working at Philip Morris. At Philip Morris back then, Philip Morris obviously made cigarettes, but they also at that time owned Kraft Foods, and they owned Miller Brewing Company. And they had about 150,000 employees in the United States and around the world. And I got to know about domestic violence because I could see it happening in the workplace. 1/3 of those employees, those 150,000 employees, were women. Domestic violence happens to occur more with women than with men, but it does happen with men, and we will talk about that. So I knew about domestic violence from up close and very personal in the workplace. So 15 years ago, think back. Some of you were probably only 5 years old, but I can assure you this country was very different 15 years ago. And it's hard to believe today just how different the country was 15 years ago. I see some heads nodding. I see some recognition of that. Back in 2003, if we cast our minds back, there was no Twitter. There was no texting. There was no social media. Astonishing, isn't it? Back in 2003, cell phones were big and black and bulky, and only a few of them took pictures. Ever seen those old movies where somebody brings out a cell phone and it looks like it's half their arm? That's the size they were. 15 years ago, people in my town thought domestic violence happened to someone else, somewhere else. And they knew it happened in inner cities, not to people who look like them. They were sure of that. And they were sure they never knew anybody who was abused. They knew that. 15 years ago, people in my town thought bullying was something that everybody had to go through. Hey, I went through it as a kid, suck it up. Everybody has to go through with it. It's just the way it is. Okay? 15 years ago, adults and children hid who they were. Nobody talked about gender. Nobody talked about gender. No. That didn't fit with the Hallmark picture. No. 15 years ago, transgender, what? Was there a word for it? Nobody knew about that. No, that didn't happen. No. 15 years ago, there were no heroin overdoses. Not in the good neighborhoods. That happened somewhere else. 15 years ago, there was no opioid epidemic. Interesting. Of course, people left the hospital with bunches of medicines and didn't exactly know what to do with them, okay? And they took them, and nurses knew, but nobody else knew. 15 years ago, my town was a microcosm of America. We looked, we acted just like the rest of the country. We were in a state of abject ignorance. That's when a small group of us got together and decided to raise awareness about domestic violence. By the way, I think that the person who's texting on the phone there, I think you're going to find it easier to listen if you look up.
I'm just taking notes.
Terrific. I'm delighted to know. That's good. Thank you for clarifying. Appreciate it. 15 years ago, a few of us got together and decided to raise awareness about domestic violence. We knew what was really happening because no one in town knew. We knew that 1 in 4 women experienced physical or emotional abuse. We knew that children in abusive households were overwhelmingly likely to repeat the toxic behavior they saw at home. Someone was asking me this afternoon about what happens to kids in homes where there's abuse. And the statistics are pretty awful. 1,500 times more likely to repeat the behaviors of dear old dad or mom. So those of us in the business community, we knew about domestic violence. We knew about the effects of domestic violence in the workplace on productivity and in terms of reduced safety and security. And we knew about those costs. We knew what happened when somebody comes into the workplace and demands to try to see the person that they've been abusing and ends up threatening people around and sometimes killing them. So we knew that. Those of us in law enforcement, we knew how lethal it was to respond to an incidence of domestic violence. Every cop in the United States fears getting the call that it's a domestic, because that's unpredictable, that's chaotic, that's dangerous. They do not know what to expect, but they know it's going to be bad. Those of us who were social workers knew that this abuse was ruining kids' lives. They saw it every day. Those of us who were teachers could see this. They'd see the effect of this in the classroom. They'd see what happened to kids. They knew it had a direct impact. Those of us who were clergy heard about this in our offices and in confessionals. But the general population didn't know or didn't choose to know. So a group of us, clergy, citizens, town officials, business people, concerned citizens, the police, we all got together. We called ourselves the New Canaan Domestic Violence Partnership. Partnership was the operative word. We were going to work together to raise awareness. But it's not enough to raise awareness. You need to have a way to help people who come forward. You can create a safe environment, but if you don't have an ability to get those people help, you haven't completed the work. Fortunately, we had an excellent domestic violence service organization nearby. They could help us. So together, this was a collaborative effort. We believe then, and we believe now, that sunshine would be the best disinfectant in this problem. Raising awareness, letting people know, and people feeling comfortable enough and safe enough to come forward and get help. It's been 15 years now. And I'm pleased to say that in 15 years we've achieved these goals. So in the past 15 years, what have we done? Well, we've spoken before every single civic group in town. Garden clubs, PTAs, men's organizations, women's organizations, every single one, and we keep speaking to them. It's a repetitive process. What are you doing now? Very important. We organize conferences for parents and students and the community. You had to let people know what this was, what it felt like, what it looked like. People began understanding that neighbors who suddenly became withdrawn and didn't come out, there was a reason for that. They began to understand what the warning signs for this looked like. We helped the police get training. You would think that the police would know, but the police don't. And let me explain why. For those of you, is anybody here from law enforcement? Okay. Let me just do a slight digression here. When the police respond to one of these incidents, it's very chaotic. It's very difficult to determine who threw the first punch, who pulled the first knife, who brought out the first gun. Dishes are flying, everything's flying. There could be blood. The kids are scared. There's a lot of screaming going on. This is a bad situation, okay? Very hard to figure out who the perpetrator is, who started all of this. Because likely this bad stuff has been going on for a long, long time. So how do you figure it out? What do you do? For that, the police need training. Without that, there's something called dual arrest. When the cops can't figure it out, they say, God, this is a mess. We're going to bring everybody down to the station house and everybody gets booked. That's not exactly the way to go. The kids are left going crazy and nobody's best interests are served. When the police get training and they learn this particular situation, they learn to recognize what the clues are. Maybe she's just defending herself. A lot of stuff is going on, but the police need training. So we got the cops training. We work with nonprofit groups. One of the great things we did was we involved, do you have something in Grand Rapids called the National Charity League? It's a great organization, and sometimes there are chapters all over the country in various places. It's generally a group of women and their daughters who get together and they do civic projects. Well, this National Charity League was terrific. Their branch in New Canaan, because in October, we asked the National Charity League, the moms and their daughters, if they would hang purple ribbons on the trees in the village. Why purple? Purple is the color of domestic violence. We wanted to do a visual sign that everybody could recognize. Sorry. To show them. So the kids, the daughters and the mothers hung the ribbons on the trees. There were a lot of purple ribbons on the trees to mark every time the police got a phone call from somebody in crisis. And one year we added to the tree trimming a special little plaque indicating how many kids were in the household when the call happened. We wanted people to understand that domestic violence is a crime that affects kids in a profound, deep, and lasting way. So the results have been pretty dramatic. First of all, people began to realize that in their isolated little perfect town, domestic violence was happening. So that was number one. We wanted to break down that isolation. We wanted to create that awareness. Number two, people began to see that they were not immune from what was going on in the rest of America. All right. In the first 10 years, now remember I said this little town has 20,000 people? In the first 10 years that this program was going on, calls to the police skyrocketed. More than 1,000 people called the police for help. This is a little town. That's 1,000 people out of 20,000. There were countless others that didn't call the police, but they called the Domestic Violence Service Operating Center in nearby Norwalk and Stamford. So let's say that's double. So you got 2,000 people out of a town of 20,000. That's a lot of folks. People suddenly became aware that this was not a one-off. This was serious. This was real. This happened regardless of ethnicity, regardless of income level, regardless of anything. The only common denominator was violence. Happily, in 15 years, the dual arrest rate has dropped. When the cops first started coming to the houses, the dual arrest rate was 50%. They didn't know who was at fault, so everybody got brought in. Now, our dual arrest rate is down to 5%. That's a tremendous achievement. That's good. The success of our little effort in this one little town spread to the 5 towns around us. They each adopted a form of a partnership. So that meant that the work we started getting copied and replicated. So more people started to get help, more awareness raising. Specifically, in about 05 and 06, the national research started to show that teen dating violence in the middle schools and the high schools was becoming a serious national issue. So we started running programs to help parents, to help kids understand what this looked like and how to deal with this. When the issues surrounding college sexual assault started to become very prevalent, we started to run programs around this. Our program has now become a requirement for all kids graduating from the local high school. They have to go through this. As Bob Dylan wrote many, many years ago, the times were a-changing, and they were changing for the right reasons. And then came December 2012. You may not remember it here in Michigan, but it's a day that everyone in Connecticut remembers. It was the day that 26 little children and their teachers were killed in Newtown, Connecticut. Newtown is only about 20 minutes away from my little town. Our police chief at the time immediately went over to Newtown to be with the police chief in Newtown. Sorry. It was a horrendous time. It was almost a repeat of 9/11 in terms of how dramatic that was. Need I remind you that the shooting in Newtown, Pennsylvania started as a number of mass shootings in this country have started? It started with a domestic violence murder. In this case, before the shooter, it was 19 years old. Before the shooter went off and killed those little kids and their extraordinary teachers, he first shot and killed his mother. There is a direct correlation, unfortunately, between many of the mass shootings in this country and domestic violence. In the wake of Newtown, the Connecticut legislature enacted laws which bolstered the work the partnership had started. These laws covered bullying. They covered gun violence prevention and children's safety. They enacted something called Safe School Climate Plans, an extraordinary group of protocols that formulate the backbone of how the high school and the middle school and the elementary schools in the town interact with students and what they're expected. And our existing laws on domestic violence and sexual assault were bolstered. They were strengthened. This particular program, which I think is remarkable, is called School Climate, and this has become, in the schools K through 12 in New Canaan, the cornerstone of all of their policies, and it is in effect a culture of respect. That is exactly what it is. The research at the tippy top of this, right at the beginning, says school climate matters. Sustained positive youth climate is associated with positive child and youth development, effective risk prevention, health promotion efforts, student learning, academic achievement, increased student graduation rates, and teacher retention. It's right there. That's it. Today, my town is in a far better place to help all our citizens than we were 15 years ago. We're not as isolated as we were 15 years ago. We're not as afraid to confront difficult issues as we were 15 years ago. Because of what a few people started, a paradigm was changed. We're now more courageous, and we're now better equipped to handle new challenges. And it's a good thing, because the challenges are tough. They are tougher than they were 15 years ago. And there are challenges that every community across the United States, whether they're little towns like mine or cities like Grand Rapids, are facing. Today, our town, just like here in Grand Rapids, there are new dangers to our kids that didn't exist in the same way 15 years ago. Recently, on a weekday night, 450 parents came out to hear about opioid addiction. Terrible, terrible problem across the country, okay? But we're looking at this square on. We're trying to figure out what to do and how to help and what to do. That's number one. Today, we're confronting issues of teen suicide. Yes, teens commit suicide. We're looking at this, we're studying this. We're not trying to bury it and say, this is unpleasant, we don't want to think about this. People are courageous and looking at it, and people are coming forward and being as honest and as authentic as they can. Today, we're confronting issues of sexting. Huge issue in our middle school. Don't know what it's like here in Grand Rapids. We're confronting it. I don't say we have the answers, but we're dealing with it, which is the most important thing. Today, we're confronting issues around anxiety. Kids everywhere, I'm sure a number of you, facing issues of anxiety issues. We're dealing with that. We haven't got it solved. Many of these problems we will not solve, but if we don't start to deal with them, they will never get attacked and looked at. Today, this little village is spending a lot of time talking about trafficking. People said 2 years ago, trafficking, what? Trafficking is something that happens in big cities. No, it doesn't. It happens everywhere. Today, we are much more aware and respectful of gender differences. Most of our communities of faith in our town, in one way or another, are sources of support for parents and youth who are struggling to find their path. It's really extraordinary how the climate of opinion around that issue alone has changed. I would not have expected this of a very conservative little town, but they surprise me continually with how they can grow. So I am optimistic about this little town. I wasn't optimistic 15 years ago when we started. I thought, I don't think they're going to get there, but they have proven me wrong. A group of concerned people have helped to make this change possible. Yes, tragedies like Newtown have forced the issue. Tragedies like teen suicide, yes, that's forced the issue, but people aren't burying it, they're dealing with it. The ripple effect of hard work has been astonishing. And I believe what we started in the little town is replicable everywhere. But it takes a few good people working hard and having the will to do this day after day, week after week, and for the long haul, year after year. The effort itself has transformed the lives of many of the people who were involved in it, and that has been a good thing for everyone. So thank you very much, and I would be delighted to take any questions that you might have. Now, they don't want me to move around. My usual practice is to roam the stage. But because we are transmitting and taping and doing, I will stay behind my barrier. But I am with you nonetheless.
Okay, so how do you attribute these results in your return to a larger scale than just, say, a little town?
How would you do it on a larger scale? How would you take it to a larger scale? Well, there are good people everywhere. There are concerned people everywhere. I would make sure I found those people. I would latch on to larger organizations that already exist and try to fuse those ideas with existing organizations. When we started this in our little town, there were no organizations like this. They were very much, let me just say, they just didn't exist. So this was the first, what I would call community action organization. But yes, the easier way is to join forces with something that already exists and to build.
Do you plan to?
Now that we've got this in effect, people are running with them on their own. They're running in a lot of different directions. So there are groups dealing with opioid addiction. There are groups dealing with trafficking. There are groups dealing with so many things that it is wonderful. They've really atomized on this, and I love that. But it's that spark that happened 15 years ago that I think set this going. So I really don't care who gets the credit for that. The result is we've got a lot of people involved and a lot of people seeing how the lives of their kids are directly impacted by the actions that they take working with these organizations to make change. Yes.
How would others, so kind of expanding on his question, how would others do the same in our community if we wanted to set initiatives such as yours or find a group that already exists if we're unaware?
Let me see if I understand. How would you repeat your question?
How would someone in our community start a group or initiative such as yours or find a group that already exists if we're unaware?
Well, how would you find a group that already exists that you could build on? Is that what you're asking me? Yeah. Well, I think the great advantage that you have is you're dealing with, just in Grand Rapids alone, you're dealing with a much larger community. So you're certainly going to have a number of social service organizations that you could reach out to immediately that we didn't have, okay? So for example, I don't know what particular issue you might be interested in, but one of the first things I might do is I might go to the Chamber of Commerce and find out who's doing what in where. Those folks tend to be aware of things that are going on. I would find the most plugged in people that I could and find out who's doing what in what area. I would do, it's what we would call in business, I'd do a feasibility study. I'd find out what's going on, because there's a high probability that for the issue you might be thinking about, someone may have already started working on that. Don't forget, in '03, there was also no way to have the kind of direct electronic contact that you have now. You are at such a greater advantage in terms of organizing than we were back then. We were still, you know, we weren't carving in stone, but it was close to it. You know, it was all mail. It's astonishing. It's 15 years has been incredible, but I would start with that. Yeah, I'm sorry, did I see a hand? Yes. Yeah.
Well, you said that we have like an advantage. Like that we have an advantage now with the technology and everything, but when you find that sometimes like a disadvantage, such as like cyberbullying and like things of that nature, so like how do you like cooperate what you did back then to now?
How do we replicate with what we did back then to now?
Right, being that there's more technology,
Being with,
cell phones, social media.
well, I think it's easier to organize. I think it's far easier to organize now because you've got all the technology working for you. I think it's easier to find out now. You can do the research that we didn't have then because it just didn't exist. You can find out where the sources are, who's involved, because there's generally people who are thinking about organizing, doing something about various issues. You have research capabilities with technology that we didn't have. You have communications capabilities with technology that we didn't have. So that's one of the things. But what is still the same, regardless of technology, is the commitment. You have to keep the commitment up, and you have to keep it steady and growing. The other thing that is important is publicity, coverage, media. The news cycle is such, even in small towns, that the coverage you get for an event is gone the next day, okay, because other events supersede. That's one of the reasons why you have to keep the message fresh all the time. You have to keep people mobilized all the time. Yeah.
Does raising awareness for these problems actually inspire action to fix them? Or does it rather inspire paranoia towards people who are usually unaffected by them?
Well, that's interesting. I haven't even thought of that. That's very interesting. Paranoia. Explain to me a little bit more about that.
Well, for example, I've never personally been affected by domestic violence, though if I heard, say, a report about the surrounding area of where I live about domestic violence, that might make me more afraid that someone might try to beat me up one night.
Well, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. That's an interesting thing. I think awareness raising, my experience with awareness raising has been a positive one. And the people that this has helped, it's been positive for them. And let me explain a little bit why that's the case. It's very, very difficult for people who are abused to come forward and get help. Extremely difficult. There's a factor of shame involved, there's embarrassment. No one wants to be known as having been humiliated in this terrible way. But if you can create some safe places where people feel comfortable enough to come forward and get help. That is terrific. And sometimes the only way you can do that is through general awareness. So, for example, let me be specific. One of the greatest advocates on this has been friends and neighbors helping people. Okay? If your friend, your neighbor, knows, suspects there may be an issue, that can be enormously helpful because that person can suggest. We want to be very careful in trying to help people who've been abused because they don't want to come forward. It's scary. A lot of things can happen. But to be the understanding friend or neighbor who can be there when that person finally decides that it's okay to tell, that it's okay then to make tiny steps forward, to break. That's huge. That's huge. And you can only do that if you've created an environment where people know what this is.
Is it okay if I ask a follow-up question?
Absolutely, why not?
With the events like you mentioned, like Newtown, there's also been more recent events like the Las Vegas shooting, the biggest massacre in American history, and the more recent Florida Parkland shooting. And my question to you is, how do you think we can prevent future instances like this? Because we've begun a massive cycle of shootings, and then it seems like nothing has been getting done to fix them.
If I were Empress. No, this is such a frustrating. I share your frustration. I really do. I can only speak from the Connecticut standpoint because I hesitate to get involved too much in the national debate because that can be pretty difficult from both sides, and I appreciate that. I can tell you that for us in Connecticut, Newtown was an extraordinary wake-up call. I like to believe that those little kids didn't die in vain. I like to believe that the reforms that have been put in place afterwards have helped people. Okay? I choose to believe that. I share your frustration. That's all I can do. Yeah. I'm with you. Yes, I'm sorry.
Is there a step-by-step procedure that your organization takes with victims with domestic violence?
I'm sorry, you have to just repeat that?
Like a step-by-step procedure that you make in an intervention with domestic violence.
Good. Is there a step-by-step intervention? Well, that's a really, really great question. So let me try to sketch out why people stay in terrible situations and why they leave. And it can be very frustrating if you have a friend or a family relative who is in one of these awful situations. People stay for a variety of very good reasons, and I always respect the person who's going through this, and we should all respect that person, even though we may be immensely frustrated by what she or he is going through. Why do they stay? They may stay for economic reasons. They may have no other place to live, number one. Number two, they may still love that person. They just want the abuse to stop. Okay. Number three, they may have been so brainwashed for so many years that it's hard for them to even think of any other way of living. As hard as that may be for you to understand or for me to understand, I can't say for you personally, I'll say for me personally, because I have not been through that. But I respect the person who has gone through that, because that has been the life that they have lived for so long. That is their normal, okay? When they decide to leave, and that is a long process generally, on average, it takes about 7 years for a person who's been abused to leave that relationship. When they decide to leave, that is the most dangerous time in their lives. Because domestic violence is all about power and control, the person who is perpetrating this wants to control their partner. Everything about the partner. Where they go, what they do, what they wear, what they eat, everything, every aspect of their life. It's almost unimaginable, but they do. When the person finally has the courage to leave, it can set off a chain of very volatile circumstances, because the perpetrator realizes that he or she is losing control. That's when bad things can happen. That's when bad things do happen. The rate of homicide of women in the United States directly correlates with domestic violence. Most women are killed by someone that they're intimate with. That's the way it is. So, when we become frustrated, those of us who work with people who are being abused, and we say to ourselves, why don't they just leave? It's because they know this is the most dangerous time. They have to do it carefully. They know that their children are at risk when they leave. They know their pets are at risk. You do know that the perpetrator will try to hurt anything that his or her partner holds dear. They will break everything, they will trash everything, they will ruin everything, they will kill the pet. They will torture the pet in front of her. She's terrified. You get the picture now. So when she tries to, and I'm using she, so please forgive me, guys, because this does happen to men, but the overwhelming amount of this abuse happens to women. Okay. So when she does try to leave, it's with a great deal of courage and terror. She is leaving a very dangerous situation, and she's going into a dangerous situation. For many years, I was the chair of the advisory board of the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And you would hear these calls coming into the hotline from women who had walked miles and miles in to find a pay telephone where they could call and seek help. It's a desperate situation. So when you're saying intervention, what we have to do when we are trying to help someone we love, care about, who is in a domestic violence situation, the best thing we can do, as hard as it is to be patient, to let that person know we're there. When they are ready to come forward, given all of the abuse and baggage that they carry, they'll come forward. They'll know you're there then. But they can't come before they're ready because they know it's at risk. Does that help?
Well, I was kind of asking about, like, what methods does your organization specifically take with any victim that comes to that is looking for aid in your same organization?
Oh, so what do we do? Okay, specifically, we make sure that they get in touch with and are helped directly by domestic service providers. Specifically, trained counselors, trained social workers, people who are going to provide the housing that they're going to need, they're going to provide the care for their children, they're going to provide the social services, they're going to provide a whole network of things. They're going to provide job opportunities, job training, the whole gamut.
And does that include like children that are
Yes.
involved too?
Absolutely, absolutely. Children are so damaged, so affected in this situation that the children need counseling. The children need a lot of counseling because the goal is not to have the children repeat the terrible behaviors that they've seen at home. You want to, what we call, you want to break that cycle of violence, because domestic violence is unfortunately one of the most serious generational crimes in this country. Not a happy message, but a hopeful one. Yes?
So my question is, with a lot of the recent events and a lot of the issues that you talked about, they
Right.
can directly affect children and teens.
Right.
But one of the things that I've been seeing recently, like in media and in, you know, people that I talk to on a day-to-day basis is, well, children are too young to understand or to be aware of these issues. Do you think there is such a thing as being too young, or do you think it's important for children to learn at a young age so that they understand as they grow up?
The latter. Children are not silent nothings going on in this. They are sponges. They've absorbed all of the horror around them. They've absorbed the tension. They've absorbed the toxicity in the environment. They have seen, they've internalized all of it. It's extraordinary when you're in a safe house. And it's an experience that I really would recommend for many people to do. When you're in a safe house and you see the women there and you see the children, you will always find a wonderful bright colored room with toys and all sorts of stuff for the kids to play in. There will also be lots of paper for the children to draw. And what they draw, right, even the small ones, they draw it all.
So then what would be some advice you have for convincing like parents and adults that they really need to help their children become aware of some issues that are going on and that could directly affect like them or their friends in the future?
I don't know that I understand completely that. You're suggesting we...
So like how would you help parents understand the need to inform their children about things that they could experience in their lives or in their friends' lives that they might, be kind of a side part to?
Okay. So the way I understand that is if the parent is going in for counseling because of domestic violence issues.
Well, not even that, just like, if their kids are going through a program at school that teaches them, about domestic violence or about bullying or teen suicide.
Okay.
How do we help parents and adults understand the necessity for children to understand that?
Okay, good question. Generally, when school systems put together programs to help children with what is called healthy relationships, that's generally the rubric, the headline of this. They do that in the positive way of reinforcing at an age-appropriate level what the appropriate behaviors are for healthy relationships, how people should be treated, whether it's the elementary school or it's middle school and so forth. And each school district is going to have a different program on this, okay, and it'll depend. Generally, parents are told ahead of time what those programs are going to be. Sometimes in many schools they fall under the health program in school. And that is when it's communicated to parents as to what those are. So generally that is covered then. If it's not, are you a parent? No. Oh, okay. If it's not, I would certainly want to ask the school, is this covered? Okay, but generally health programs, I know from in my local area, the health programs are very concerned with teaching respectful behavior that is age appropriate. There used to be something years ago, some of you may have heard, called hands are not for hitting, okay, or various versions of that, to try to help children understand that we settle arguments not by fists. Okay.
For just one more question?
You mentioned a program that's required, I believe, of high school students. You said as they're transitioning out of high school, correct?
Yes, the program I was referring to was a program that we have for high school seniors on getting ready for college, particularly with sexual assault issues.
Okay, and I believe you said it's a required program.
It is now a required program in the high school, exactly.
And so I'm
Senior
curious.
year, it's April of senior year, so it's fresh in mind before graduation.
So I'm curious, because in light of the context that you've, in the history that you've presented with us today, it sounds like an appropriate intervention, if not solution. But I'm sure there probably was opposition, perhaps. And so could you share a little bit about that? If there was opposition to that requirement of the seniors in April, what groups opposed it and why?
You're good. You're good. Yes, there was opposition. Yes, there was opposition, right? And that's a great story to sort of close out some of this with. Not everybody embraces change, even when it seems like it's such an easy, good thing for everyone. There was a small group, and there is a small group of parents in my town who believe that those issues, college sexual assault, let's just use one for example, can best be handled at home. We don't need to have that in school. Terrific. Great. I have no problem what they want to teach their children at home. But I have a major problem if they deny the majority of high school seniors the opportunity to hear about programs and advice that could help them be successful in their relationships in college. That I have an issue with. And so, we offered this program to parents and children as a standalone program 3 years ago. The response was terrific, okay? And we talked to the high school. And the high school said, yes, we'd love to have you come in and do the same program. We didn't hear anything. I suspected that maybe there was a little pushback. But the forces of right prevailed, and the high school decided to develop its own program, basically covering some of the same material that we covered, and they are doing it, and they have done it for 2 years in a row now. So I am pleased that the majority of students were able to get this information that was valuable and useful, and that all went well. Sometimes things work. Thank you very much. You've been a great audience. Thanks a lot.
I want to thank all of you for being here this evening and for really tremendous questions. Ms. Bartlett mentioned the National Domestic Violence Hotline. That's something that's available 365, 24/7. There's also locally Stop Kent Violence, which could also provide information and education around that for you and those you love. And Ms. Bartlett, I thank you so much for bringing this important message to us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.